Zorath Vel stood at the front of his command deck and looked down at the blue planet spinning slowly beneath his ship. It was a small world. Water covered most of it. The creatures living on its surface had not even left their own star system yet. They were nothing. They were dust beneath the boots of the Velthari Collective. Just like every other species, the Collective had crushed over the last 9,000 years. He turned to his lieutenant, a tall and scarred officer named Ilketh, and gave a simple nod. Ilketh understood. He had seen this same moment play out on 42 other worlds. The routine never changed. You find a planet. You fire a single warning shot into something that does not matter. An ocean, a desert, an empty stretch of land. The blast is big enough to shake their entire civilization. Then you send a message. Kneel, or the next one lands on your cities. Every species, without exception, chose to kneel. The plasma lance on the belly of the Pale Dominion hummed to life. A column of white-blue fire punched down through the atmosphere and struck the Pacific Ocean about 60 miles southwest of a chain of islands the humans called Hawaii. The beam hit the water and turned it into steam in an instant. A circle of ocean 5 miles wide simply vanished, replaced by a roaring crater of superheated vapor. The shockwaves spread outward in every direction, pushing walls of water toward every coastline within reach. The tsunamis hit within hours. Coastal towns across the Hawaiian Islands took the worst of it. Smaller waves rolled into California, Japan, and the Philippines. Emergency sirens screamed. People ran. Many did not run fast enough. By the time the water settled, over 2,000 people were dead, and tens of thousands more were hurt or missing. Hospitals overflowed. Roads were gone. Entire neighborhoods had been swallowed by the sea, and then spit back out as fields of broken wood and twisted metal. In Washington, Admiral Nate Caldwell was sitting in a restaurant with his wife when his phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then it did not stop buzzing. He read the first message, put down his fork, kissed his wife on the forehead, and walked out the door without saying a word. She had been married to him long enough to know what that kind of silence meant. 30 minutes later, he was underground, standing in a room full of screens and uniforms, and barely controlled panic. Satellite footage played on the main display. The moment of impact, the expanding ring of destruction, the waves rolling outward like the planet itself was flinching. Beside him, Colonel Lucy Tran was already pulling data from every orbital tracking system the Air Force had access to. She pointed at a shape sitting in high orbit, roughly 300 miles above the surface. It was big. It was not from any country on Earth. "That is what fired on us," she said. Her voice was flat and steady, the way it always got when things were very bad. Nate had worked with her for 6 years, and he had learned that the calmer Lucy sounded, the worse the situation actually was. Right now she sounded like she was reading a weather report. The president arrived within the hour and sat at the head of the table with the Joint Chiefs around him. Everyone talked at once for about 2 minutes. Then the president held up his hand, and the room went quiet. He looked at Nate. Nate looked back. There was not much to say that the screens were not already saying. Something was up there. It had killed over 2,000 Americans and thousands more across the Pacific, and it was still sitting in orbit, waiting. The room was afraid. Nate could feel it in the air, thick as smoke. But he could feel something else too. Something underneath the fear. Something hot and sharp. Every face around that table carried the same expression. Not just shock, not just grief, but a deep and personal anger. These people had spent their entire careers preparing for threats. They had trained for wars between nations, for terrorist attacks, for cyber weapons and dirty bombs. Nobody had trained for this. But the anger did not care about training. The anger only cared about the fact that something had reached down from the sky and killed their people. And it was still up there, looking down at them like they were insects. 3,000 miles away, in a windowless building tucked into the desert outside Socorro, New Mexico, a man named Danny Ortiz was staring at his computer screen, with his mouth open. Danny was 34 years old, a civilian astrophysicist who had spent the last 3 years listening to the sky for signals that most of his colleagues believed would never come. He had been called a dreamer, a waste of funding, a man chasing ghosts. Now the ghosts were here, and they were talking. The alien vessel was broadcasting on every frequency Danny's equipment could detect. Radio, microwave, infrared, even bands that human technology barely had names for. The signal was a loop, repeating every 90 seconds, structured in a way that was clearly meant to be decoded. Danny and his small team worked through it in hours. The message was not complicated. It was not a greeting. It was not a question. It said, "Kneel, or the next strike will not be a warning." Danny leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He had spent years hoping that the first message from another civilization would be something beautiful. A mathematical proof, a piece of music, a simple hello. Instead, it was a threat. A demand for surrender from a species that looked at Earth the way a boot looks at an ant. He picked up his phone and called the only government contact he had, a mid-level defense analyst who had once asked Danny to consult on a satellite project. The phone rang twice. "You need to patch me through to whoever is running this," Danny said. "I know what they said. I translated it." There was a pause on the other end. Then the analyst asked Danny to hold. 2 minutes later, Danny was talking to a colonel. 5 minutes after that, he was talking to Admiral Nate Caldwell directly. He read the message out loud, word for word. The line was silent for a long time. "These things have no idea what they just walked into," Danny said quietly. He did not know yet how right he was. On the pale Dominion, Zorath Vel watched the planet below him with the patient calm of someone who had done this so many times that it bored him. He expected the usual response, confused transmissions, panicked leaders, and within a day or two, a formal surrender. He gave the humans 1 full rotation of their planet, 24 of their small hours. Then, if they had not answered, he would choose a city and erase it. He settled into his command chair and closed his eyes. This would not take long. It never did. Far below him, in offices and bunkers and military bases across every continent on Earth, lights were turning on, phones were ringing, generals were being pulled from their beds, scientists were running to their labs, soldiers were checking their weapons. And in a quiet restaurant in Virginia, Nate Caldwell's wife cleared his untouched plate and turned on the news, and watched the ocean burn, and understood that the world her husband was going to come home to, if he came home at all, would never be the same. The clock had started. Humanity had 24 hours, but humanity was not going to use those hours to kneel. Humanity was going to use them to get angry, get organized, and get ready to do something that no species in the history of the Velthari Collective had ever done before. The first 12 hours after the strike were chaos. Every news channel on the planet showed the same footage on a loop. The column of fire punching into the ocean, the waves swallowing the coast, the bodies pulled from the water, the children crying in shelters. Governments issued statements. People panicked. Grocery stores were emptied in hours. Highways jammed as millions tried to get away from the coasts, even though nobody really knew where was safe. But something strange happened in the hours that followed. Something that Zorath Vel, sitting in his command chair high above the earth, would not have understood even if someone had explained it to him. The panic did not last. It burned hot and fast like a grass fire, and then it turned into something else. Something harder. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous. Nations that had spent decades threatening each other stopped talking and started listening. The President of the United States called Moscow, Beijing, London, New Delhi, and Tokyo within 3 hours of the strike. Every call was short. Every leader said the same thing in different words. This is bigger than us. The old fights do not matter right now. What do you need and what can you give? The United Nations held an emergency session 14 hours after the strike. It was the shortest session in the history of the organization. There were no long speeches. There were no arguments about borders or trade or old grudges. A resolution was drafted in 40 minutes and passed unanimously. It created a combined planetary defense command with full authority to coordinate every military force on Earth. Admiral Nate Caldwell was named Supreme Military Coordinator by a vote that took less than 2 minutes. Nate stood in the Situation Room and felt the weight of it land on his shoulders like a slab of concrete. He had commanded fleets, planned operations, sent people into harm's way, and lived with the consequences. But this was different. This was not a war between countries. This was a war for the survival of every human being alive. He looked at the faces around him. American generals, Russian admirals, Chinese commanders, British intelligence officers, Indian weapons specialists, and he saw the same thing in every pair of eyes. Fear, yes, but also a stubborn, teeth-gritting refusal to go quietly. He gave his first order within the hour. Every nuclear submarine on Earth was to surface just long enough to receive new targeting coordinates and then dive again. Every satellite with any kind of sensor was to be pointed at the alien ship. Every air force on the planet was to move its fastest aircraft to forward staging areas. And every scientist who had ever worked on anything related to electromagnetic pulse technology, directed energy, or orbital mechanics was to report to a secure facility immediately. Colonel Lucy Tran was placed in charge of the Rapid Strike Task Force. Her job was to take the best weapons and pilots from a dozen different countries and turn them into a single fighting unit in less than 24 hours. It was an impossible task. She did it anyway. She worked from a command center in Colorado, sleeping in 20-minute bursts on a cot in the corner of the room. The problems came at her like waves. Russian pilots who did not speak English. Chinese orbital defense platforms that ran on software nobody else could read. French missile systems that used different targeting protocols than American ones. Officers who had been trained their entire lives to fight each other and now had to trust each other with everything. Lucy handled all of it with the same flat, steady voice she always used. She did not yell. She did not beg. She simply told people what needed to happen and made it clear, without ever raising her voice, that failure was not something she was willing to accept. A Russian colonel challenged her authority on a conference call. She let him finish talking, then quietly listed every flaw in his proposed attack plan, and offered a better one in 30 seconds. He did not challenge her again. In New Mexico, Danny Ortiz had not slept since the strike. He had been moved from his small listening post to a secure government facility, where he now led a team of over 200 scientists from 11 countries. Their job was to find a weakness in the alien ship. Any weakness at all. Danny had always been the kind of person who saw patterns where others saw noise. It was what made him a good astrophysicist and a terrible poker player. Now he poured that talent into the data his instruments were pulling from the Veltari cruiser. He studied the energy readings from the plasma lance strike. He analyzed the electromagnetic field surrounding the ship. He mapped every signal it was broadcasting and every signal it was receiving. On the second day, he found it. The alien ship had shields, a dense energy barrier that wrapped around the entire vessel like a second skin. Conventional weapons would bounce off it like rain off a window. But the shield was not static. It pulsed. It cycled through different electromagnetic frequencies in a pattern that repeated every 47 seconds. Danny realized that if you hit the shield at exactly the right frequency, at exactly the right moment, the energy would not bounce off. Like pushing on a door, at the exact moment someone on the other side pulls it open. The problem was that you could not do it with just one shot. You would need multiple strikes, each tuned to a different frequency, fired in rapid sequence, to walk your way through the cycle and catch the gap. It was like trying to pick a lock with a sledgehammer, except Danny was going to figure out which way each pin needed to turn. He sent his findings up the chain with a note that said he could build a set of electromagnetic pulse warheads that would crack the shield. But he needed access to every nuclear warhead modification facility on the planet, and he needed it now. Nate Caldwell read the report, asked Lucy Tran if the delivery system could work, and when she said yes, he authorized everything Danny asked for within the hour. High above them all, Zorath Vel waited. His lieutenant Ilketh stood beside him on the command deck, watching the planet turn below them. The humans had not transmitted a surrender. Ilketh mentioned this the way someone might mention a mild change in the weather, not concerned, just noting it. Zorath waved a long hand dismissively. Some species took longer than others. The ones that lived in divided nations were often the slowest because they wasted time arguing among themselves about who had the authority to surrender. He had seen it before. The arguing always ended the same way. He gave them a few more hours, then he would select a city. He did not know that the arguing had already ended. He did not know that the divided nations had united faster than any civilization in Velthari records. He did not know that right now, across every continent, millions of people were not arguing at all, but working, welding, coding, loading, fueling, planning, and preparing. He did not know about Nate Caldwell, who had not left the Situation Room in 36 hours, and was running on coffee and cold fury. He did not know about Lucy Tran, who had built a strike force out of spare parts and willpower that was now coiled and ready like a fist. He did not know about Danny Ortiz, who had found the crack in his armor and was building the tools to pry it wide open. He did not know any of this because he had never needed to know such things before. No species had ever done what these humans were doing. Every civilization he had conquered had spent its final hours begging, hiding, or turning on each other. The idea that a species might spend those hours getting ready to punch back simply did not exist in his experience. He leaned back in his chair and watched the planet with the bored patience of a predator who had never been bitten. Below him, 6 billion people were sharpening their teeth. The 24 hours were almost up. But Zorath Vel was not the one who should have been counting. The 24 hours ran out at exactly 3:17 in the morning, Eastern Time. On the pale Dominion, Zorath Vel opened his eyes and looked at the planet below. No surrender had come. He felt a flicker of annoyance, the way someone might feel when a simple task takes longer than expected. He turned to Ilketh and told him to select a target, something large, something the humans could not ignore. Ilketh studied the scans of the planet's surface and pointed to a dense cluster of life signs on a large island in the Western Ocean. The humans called it Tokyo. Over 30 million of them lived there, packed into towers of glass and steel. A single land strike at full power would kill millions and flatten everything within 50 miles. After that, the survivors would surrender. They always did. Zorath gave the order. The plasma lance began its charging cycle. A deep hum that vibrated through the bones of the ship, building in intensity like a heartbeat, getting faster and faster. In 2 minutes, it would fire. In 3, Tokyo would be gone. He never got those 2 minutes. 1,200 miles below the Pale Dominion, in a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, Lucy Tran watched a single red light blink on her display. It was the energy spike from the alien ship's weapon system, the same signature Danny Ortiz had identified during the first strike. The lance was charging. She had less than 120 seconds. She did not hesitate. She had been waiting for this moment for 2 days. Every plan, every argument, every sleepless hour had led to this single point. She pressed her hand flat on the comm panel and spoke one word into every military channel on Earth. Now. The planet answered. From submarines beneath the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, modified intercontinental ballistic missiles broke the surface and roared into the sky, trailing columns of white fire. From silos in Montana, North Dakota, Siberia, and western China, more missiles launched. From mobile platforms in the deserts of Saudi Arabia and the plains of India, still more. 27 missiles in total, fired from 9 different countries, all aimed at the same point in high orbit. Each one carried a warhead that Danny Ortiz had helped design in a 72-hour sprint of caffeine and desperation. Electromagnetic pulse devices, each tuned to a different frequency on the Velthari shield cycle. They hit the sky like a swarm of bright needles. On the pale Dominion, Ilketh's console screamed a warning. Incoming projectiles. 24 of them, converging from multiple directions. He reported it to Zorath, with more surprise than concern. The humans were throwing rocks, primitive chemical rockets. The shields would handle them the way they had handled every other species' weapons, by turning them to vapor on contact. The first wave arrived. 7 missiles struck the shield and exploded in bursts of white light. The shield held. Energy rippled across its surface like rings on a pond, but not a single pulse got through. Ilketh allowed himself a thin smile. This was exactly how it always went. The second wave hit 4 seconds later. These warheads were different. They did not just explode. They pulsed, each one screaming a specific electromagnetic frequency into the shield, like a tuning fork pressed against glass. The shield shuddered. The ripples became waves. Ilketh's smile disappeared. The third wave. Each set of warheads hit a different frequency, walking up the harmonic cycle that Danny had mapped from his desk in New Mexico. The shield flickered like a candle in a strong wind. Zorath gripped the arms of his chair and stared at the display. This was not possible. No primitive species had ever decoded the shield harmonics. It took the Velthari themselves centuries to develop this technology, and these creatures had cracked it in 3 days. The fifth wave struck. The shield collapsed. For one terrible, beautiful second, the pale Dominion hung naked in the void, its armor gone, its skin exposed to the cold of space, and the fury of a planet that had decided it was not going to die on its knees. Lucy Tran's voice cut through the comm channels again. Fire the rods. From a platform in low orbit, a hastily modified Chinese space station that no government had officially admitted existed, 3 tungsten rods, each one 20 feet long and weighing 4,000 pounds, were released. They had no engines. They had no explosives. They were just metal, falling toward the alien ship at 17,000 miles per hour, aimed by gravity and rage and very precise math. The first rod missed. The second hit the port engine array and punched through the hull like a needle through cloth. The third struck the midsection of the ship and tore a hole large enough to fly a helicopter through. Atmosphere vented from the wound in a white plume. The ship lurched sideways, its orbit destabilized, its systems screaming. On the command deck, Zorath Vel was thrown from his chair. He hit the floor hard and felt something crack in his side. Alarms filled the air. Damage reports flooded every screen. The port engine was gone. The plasma lance was offline. 3 decks were open to space. Over 100 crew members were dead. He pulled himself upright and stared at the main display, where the blue planet still turned below him, calm and bright and completely indifferent to his pain. Something cold moved through his chest, and it took him a long moment to recognize what it was. He had not felt it in over 300 years. It was doubt. Ilketh was shouting orders, trying to reroute power, seal breaches, stabilize the orbit. Zorath barely heard him. He was staring at the data on his screen, the trajectory analysis, the frequency mapping, the coordinated timing of the human attack. These creatures had studied his ship for 3 days and built weapons specifically designed to kill it. They had fired from 9 different nations in perfect unison. They had decoded technology it took his species centuries to develop. They were not insects. They were something else entirely. Something the collective had never seen before. In the bunker beneath the Rockies, Nate Caldwell stood in the center of the room and watched the satellite feed. The alien ship was wounded. It was venting atmosphere. Its main weapon was dark. Around him, officers and analysts were on their feet, some of them cheering, some of them just staring at the screen, with their hands pressed over their mouths. Nate allowed himself 5 seconds. He closed his eyes and breathed. And in those 5 seconds, he felt the weight lift just enough for him to keep standing. Then he opened his eyes, and the weight came back, because the job was not done. A wounded animal was the most dangerous kind. The ship was crippled but not dead. If it had backup weapons, or if it could repair itself, or if it decided to crash itself into the planet out of spite, millions would still die. He opened a channel to Lucy. Phase 2, he said. Lucy nodded even though he could not see her. She switched channels and connected to a secure military frequency. On the other end was a voice she had briefed 12 hours ago, calm, steady, and just a little bit amused despite everything. Sergeant Vega, she said. The door is open. Your team is go. In the cargo bay of a modified space shuttle that had been launched from Cape Canaveral 6 hours earlier under complete radio silence, a man named Carlos Vega stood up from his seat and looked at the 11 men and women who had volunteered for the most insane mission in the history of warfare. They were Marines, special operators, combat engineers, the best fighters from 4 different countries, strapped into pressure suits and armed with weapons that had been modified just hours ago, based on Danny Ortiz's analysis of Valthari hull composition. Carlos checked his rifle. He checked his suit seals. He looked at his team, and every one of them looked back with the same expression. Scared, steady, and ready. Nobody said this job would be easy, he said. But nobody said it would be boring either. We go in, we take the bridge, and we come home. That is the whole plan. Questions? Nobody had questions. The shuttle adjusted its course and began its approach to the crippled alien cruiser, drifting toward the gaping wound in its side like a fish swimming into the mouth of a whale. Behind them, the earth glowed blue and white and green, still turning, still alive, still fighting. Ahead of them, the darkness of the ship waited. The shuttle slid through the breach in the Pale Dominion's hull with less than 6 feet of clearance on either side. Carlos Vega felt the craft shudder as it scraped against twisted alien metal, and then they were inside. The pilot, a woman from the Indian Air Force named Priya, who had not spoken a single unnecessary word since the mission began, set them down on a flat surface that might have been a cargo deck. The landing was hard. Nobody complained. Carlos was the first one out. He dropped to the deck with his rifle raised and swept his flashlight across a space so large that the beam disappeared into darkness before it found a wall. The air was thin but breathable. The ship's atmosphere had not fully vented from this section. It smelled wrong, though. Not like metal or chemicals or anything Carlos could name. It smelled like something alive. Something old. The rest of the team filed out behind him. 12 people in pressure suits, carrying rifles, explosives, and cutting tools, standing in the belly of an alien warship, 300 miles above the earth. The silence was enormous. Carlos could hear his own heartbeat in his helmet, and the slow breathing of the person behind him. Nothing else. No alarms, no footsteps. Just the deep, groaning creak of a wounded ship settling around them like a dying animal, adjusting its weight. Danny Ortiz's voice crackled in his earpiece from the ground. Danny had been given a direct line to the boarding team because he was the only person on Earth who could read the electromagnetic signatures of the ship's internal systems. He could see the power conduits through the hull, the way a doctor reads veins on an X-ray. He told Carlos to move forward and take the second corridor on the left. The command bridge was roughly half a mile ahead and 7 decks up. He said it like he was giving directions to a coffee shop. Carlos gave the signal and the team moved. The corridors of the Pale Dominion were built for creatures taller than humans. The ceilings were high, the doorways wide, and everything was curved in ways that made the spaces feel organic, as if the ship had been grown rather than built. The walls gave off a faint bioluminescent glow, pale green, barely enough to see by. The team moved by flashlight and infrared, checking every corner, every doorway, every shadow. They made it 400 yards before the Valthari found them. The first sign was a sound, a rapid clicking, like stones being struck together, echoing from somewhere ahead. Carlos raised his fist, and the team froze. Then the clicking stopped, and for 2 seconds there was nothing but silence. Carlos had been in enough fights to know what that silence meant. It meant something was about to happen. 3 Valthari soldiers came around the corner at full speed. They were tall, nearly 8 feet, covered in dark segmented armor that moved with their bodies like a second skin. They carried weapons that looked like long curved bones, fused with metal. Their faces were narrow, with too many eyes and mouths that split in the wrong direction. They fired first. A bolt of blue-white energy hit the wall beside Carlos and melted a hole the size of a basketball through solid metal. The heat washed over him like opening an oven door. He dropped to one knee and returned fire. His rifle barked 3 times. The first round bounced off the lead soldier's armor. The second cracked it. The third went through. The corridor became a storm. Both sides fired at once, filling the narrow space with light and noise and the smell of burning metal. 2 of Carlos's team went down in the first 5 seconds. A British commando named Pete who took a bolt through the chest plate, and a German engineer named Hannah who was hit in the leg and thrown against the wall. The team medic, a quiet man from Texas named Sam Ochoa, dragged both of them behind cover, while the rest of the team laid down fire. The Velthari fought with precision. They moved in formation, covering each other, advancing in coordinated steps like a machine. But Carlos noticed something in the first 30 seconds of the fight that changed everything. They did not adapt. When he flanked left, they adjusted, but they adjusted the same way every time, the same angle, the same spacing, the same rhythm. It was like fighting someone who had memorized a playbook, but had never had to improvise. He started calling out their movements. Left side, 2 steps, firing high. His team adjusted. Center 1 is going to push forward in 3 seconds. They were ready. Right side drops back when center pushes. Put rounds on the right side now. They did, and the right side Velthari staggered under concentrated fire that found the gaps in its armor. In 90 seconds, all 3 Velthari soldiers were down. Carlos knelt beside Pete. The British commando was alive, but hurt badly. His chest plate cracked open and the suit beneath scorched. Sam was already working on him with steady hands and a face that showed nothing. Carlos put his hand on Pete's shoulder and told him he was going to be fine, which they both knew might not be true, but was the right thing to say. He left Sam with the wounded and pushed forward with the remaining 9. Danny's voice guided them through service tunnels and around sealed blast doors, taking routes that avoided the largest clusters of Velthari life signs. They crossed a wide chamber that might have been a mess hall, where the remains of alien meals still sat on curved tables, abandoned when the ship was hit. They moved through sections where the hull damage had opened rooms to space, sealed only by emergency barriers that hummed with failing energy. 3 more firefights. Each one was sharp and violent and over quickly, because Carlos had learned the Velthari pattern now, and his team trusted his calls. The aliens were strong and fast, and their weapons were terrifying, but they fought the same way every time. They had never faced an enemy that learned during the fight, that changed tactics between one heartbeat and the next, that treated every new piece of information as a weapon to be used immediately. By the time the team reached the command deck, they had lost one more, a Korean Marine named Jun, who had held a corridor alone for 40 seconds so the rest of the team could get through a locked door. Carlos did not have time to mourn. He would do that later, if there was a later. The command deck door was massive, made of something that looked like metal but felt warm to the touch. Danny told him the bridge was on the other side. 12 Velthari life signs, including one that was putting out an energy signature much stronger than the others. That would be the commander. Carlos looked at his team. 8 people, tired and bleeding and running low on ammunition. He asked if anyone wanted to wait outside. Nobody moved. A woman from the French Foreign Legion named Claire actually laughed. A short, hard sound that meant exactly what it needed to mean. They blew the door. The shaped charges punched through the alien metal, and the team poured in like water through a broken dam. The bridge was wide and circular, filled with curved consoles and holographic displays that showed the damaged state of the ship in colors humans had no names for. Velthari officers turned from their stations, some reaching for weapons, some frozen in shock. They had never been boarded. In 9,000 years of conquest, no species had ever gotten this far. The fight was short. It was not clean or pretty or heroic. It was close-quarters violence in a confined space. Rifles and fists and the desperate fury of people who had come too far to stop now. An alien officer grabbed Carlos by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one arm. Carlos jammed his sidearm under the officer's chin and pulled the trigger twice. He hit the ground hard and kept moving. When the smoke cleared and the last console stopped sparking, 9 Velthari officers were down, and 3 were on their knees with their hands. Too many fingers, too many joints, raised in the air. Standing at the back of the bridge, against a wide viewport that showed the curve of the earth below, was Zorath Vel. He was taller than the others. His armor was different. Darker, older, covered in markings that might have been rank insignia, or battle honors, or something humans had no word for. He had not drawn a weapon. He stood perfectly still and looked at Carlos with all 6 of his eyes. And in that look there was not fear, but something much larger. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been broken in half. Carlos walked toward him. His suit was cracked. His visor was smeared with something he did not want to think about. His hands were shaking, though he would never admit that to anyone. He raised his rifle and pointed it at the alien commander's face. Zorath Vel looked at the weapon. Then, slowly, the great conqueror of 42 worlds lowered himself to his knees. Carlos stared down at him and thought about the people on the beaches of Hawaii, about the 2,000 dead, about Pete and June and every person who had given something to get to this moment. He wanted to say something grand, something historic. He was a Marine sergeant from El Paso, Texas, and grand speeches were not his specialty. "This is how humans say hello," he said. It was enough. On Earth, in the bunker beneath the Rockies, Nate Caldwell watched the helmet cam footage and sat down slowly in his chair. Around him, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and then Nate put his face in his hands and let himself breathe for the first time in 4 days. It was not over, he knew that, but for right now, for this one impossible moment, it was enough. The pale Dominion did not fall out of orbit. It wanted to. Its remaining engines sputtered and groaned like a sick animal trying to stand, and for 6 terrifying hours after the boarding, the massive cruiser drifted lower and lower toward the atmosphere. Engineers on the ground ran calculations and held their breath. If the ship came down uncontrolled, it would hit the surface like a small asteroid, and the impact would make the original strike look like a raindrop. It was Danny Ortiz who figured out how to stabilize it. Working from the ground with a team of engineers and 2 very tired Velthari prisoners who had decided that cooperation was better than dying in a fireball, he talked Carlos Vega's team through the process of restarting the starboard engine array. The instructions had to be translated from Velthari technical language into English, then simplified into words that a Marine sergeant could act on while standing in front of a console covered in symbols he could not read. It took 4 hours. Carlos burned his hand twice on panels that were not designed for human skin temperature. But the engine fired, the orbit stabilized, and the ship stopped falling. 3 days later, a fleet of modified space shuttles carried the first wave of human scientists and engineers aboard the crippled cruiser. Danny Ortiz was on the first shuttle. He stepped onto the alien deck and stood still for a long time, looking around at the vast corridors and the strange light and the impossible scale of everything. And he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not excitement. Grief. Grief for the boy he had been, sitting in a field in New Mexico at age 12, looking up at the stars and hoping that whatever was out there would be friendly. That boy was gone now. The universe was not friendly, but it was real, and it was waiting, and Danny was going to learn everything it had to teach him. His teams tore the ship apart piece by piece over the following weeks, not physically, but intellectually. They mapped every system, cataloged every piece of technology, and slowly began to understand what the Velthari Collective actually was. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and strangely sad. The Collective controlled over 100 star systems. It had subjugated 43 species, each one stripped of its weapons, its culture, and its will to resist. The Velthari did not hate the species they conquered. They did not even think about them very much. They treated them the way humans treated livestock, as resources to be managed, not minds to be respected. But the most important discovery was the communication network. The Velthari used a system of subspace relays, devices that could transmit signals faster than light, bouncing them across the galaxy through a chain of stations embedded in the fabric of space itself. The Pale Dominion had a transmitter powerful enough to reach every relay in the network, which meant it could reach every ship, every colony, and every conquered world in the Collective. Danny brought the idea to Nate Caldwell on a Tuesday morning. He walked into the Situation Room with dark circles under his eyes, a tablet in his hand, and a look on his face that Nate had come to recognize as the expression Danny wore when he had thought of something either brilliant or insane or both. "We can send a message," Danny said. "Not just to the Velthari, to everyone. Every species they have conquered. Every world they have silenced. We can use their own transmitter to broadcast on every channel in the network." Nate leaned back in his chair and looked at Danny for a long time. He was tired. He had been tired for weeks. The world outside was still recovering from the strike, rebuilding coasts, burying the dead, arguing about what to do next. Some people wanted to destroy the alien ship. Some wanted to hide it. Some wanted to pretend none of this had ever happened and go back to fighting each other over oil and territory and all the small things that had seemed so important a month ago. "What would we say?" Nate asked. Danny set the tablet on the table. "I have some ideas, but I think this one needs more than just me." They assembled a team for the message. It was the strangest writing committee in the history of language. 3 linguists, 2 diplomats, a poet from Lagos who had been writing about the stars since she was a child, Lucy Tran because she refused to be left out of anything, and Danny Ortiz because he understood the technology and because he had been the first person on Earth to read the Velthari's words, and he wanted to be part of writing humanity's answer. They argued for 2 days. They wrote drafts and threw them away. They fought about every word, every phrase, every comma. The diplomats wanted something measured and careful. The poet wanted something that would burn. Lucy wanted something short enough that no one could misunderstand it. Danny wanted something true. In the end, they found the words. Not because any one person wrote them, but because all of them together, sitting in a room with bad coffee and no sleep, and the weight of the whole species on their backs, managed to say the thing that needed to be said. Nate read the final draft in silence. Then he read it again. Then he picked up a pen and signed the authorization. The broadcast was set for a Thursday evening, Earth time. Carlos Vega's team was still aboard the Pale Dominion, and it was Carlos who stood on the bridge when the transmitter powered up. He did not understand the technology. He did not need to. He understood what it meant. A month ago he had been a Marine sergeant running training exercises in North Carolina. Now he was standing on the bridge of an alien warship, about to send a message to the galaxy. Life was strange. Lucy coordinated the broadcast from the ground, making sure the signal was clean and strong, and pointed in every direction at once. Danny monitored the subspace relays, watching the signal propagate outward through the network like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading wider and wider until they touched shores no human had ever seen. The message went out at 7:42 in the evening. It traveled at speeds that made light look slow, bouncing from relay to relay, reaching deeper and deeper into the territory of the Collective. It was translated automatically by the Velthari network into every language the Collective used, all 43 tongues of the conquered species, plus the Velthari language itself. It said this: "This is humanity. We are a species from a small blue world orbiting a yellow star in the outer arm of this galaxy. 1 month ago, a ship of the Velthari Collective fired a warning at our planet and told us to kneel. We did not kneel. We fought. We won. The ship that fired on us is now ours. To the Velthari Collective, we send this warning in return. We did not start this, but we will finish it. Do not come to our world again unless you come in peace. To every species that has been conquered, silenced, or enslaved by the Collective, we send this message. You are not alone. We do not know your names yet, but we will learn them. We do not know your stories yet, but we will hear them. And we want you to know this one thing. We are humanity. We do not kneel, and we are coming. On a mining world in a system with no name that humans knew, a species of small, quiet beings with silver skin and two large eyes heard the message over the speakers that the Velthari had installed to broadcast work orders. They stopped what they were doing. They looked at each other. They had not smiled in 3 generations. Some of them remembered how. On a water world, where an aquatic species had been forced to drain their own oceans to feed Velthari agriculture, the message came through on sealed communication buoys that had not carried anything but orders in over a century. The beings who heard it gathered in the deep places where the Velthari could not follow, and they spoke in low tones about a word they had almost forgotten. The word was hope. On dozens of other worlds, in dozens of other languages, the same thing happened. A message from a species nobody had ever heard of, from a planet nobody had ever seen, saying the one thing that the Collective had spent 9,000 years making sure nobody ever said again. We are here, we are free, and you can be too. Zorath Vel heard the broadcast from his holding cell on Earth. They had given him a small room with a cot and a screen that showed news feeds he could not fully understand. But the message came through in his own language, and he understood every word. He sat on the edge of his cot for a very long time. He thought about the 42 worlds he had conquered. He thought about the species he had broken, the civilizations he had ended, the cultures he had ground to dust beneath the boot of the Collective. He had done it without guilt, because he had believed, truly and completely, that the strong had the right to rule the weak. It was the natural order. It was the way the universe worked. But these humans, these small, fragile, short-lived creatures on their tiny blue world, they had looked at the natural order and said no, not with a prayer or a plea, but with a fist. They had cracked his shields, crippled his ship, stormed his bridge, and brought him to his knees. And now they were sending a message to every corner of his empire, telling every conquered species that the natural order was a lie. He thought about all of this, and then, for the first time in his 300-year life, Zorath Vel laughed. It was not a cruel laugh or a mocking one. It was the laugh of a man who had just watched everything he believed in come apart at the seams, and who understood, finally and completely, that the universe was much stranger, and much more wonderful, and much more dangerous than he had ever imagined. On a balcony in Virginia, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, where the waves were calm and the sky was clear, and the stars were coming out, one by one, Nate Caldwell stood with his hands on the railing and breathed the salt air. Lucy Tran walked out and stood beside him. She did not say anything for a while. They just watched the ocean together. 2 tired people who had helped save the world and were only now starting to feel the weight of it. "What happens next?" Lucy asked. Nate looked at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, beyond the ocean and the sky and the thin blue shell of the atmosphere, the galaxy was listening to a message from Earth. Somewhere out there, species were hearing the word hope for the first time in centuries. Somewhere out there, the Velthari Collective was learning that the universe had just changed, and that it had been changed by a species they had dismissed as dust. "We build," Nate said. "We learn, we get ready, and we make sure that the next time someone comes knocking, we answer the door so hard that nobody ever knocks again." Lucy nodded. The stars came out above them, thousands of them, millions, each one a sun with worlds of its own, full of stories humanity had not yet heard, and people humanity had not yet met. The galaxy was vast and old and full of danger. But it was also, as of tonight, full of something new. a species that did not kneel. And that, as the Velthari were beginning to understand, changed everything.